In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a turtleneck. For this project, you're going to need pins, measuring tape, thread, scissors, and a stretch fabric. I'm going to show 3 ways of creating the pattern. My favorite way is to trace an already existing garment that I like the fit of. Starting with the back of the pattern, I'm going to cut along the side seams and the armhole seams, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. And then I'm going to cut the shoulder seam, ignoring the neckline. For the armholes, I like to fold my fabric in half to make sure that both sides are exactly equal. And then I trim using the side I already cut out as a guide. So I've cut the side seams, the armholes, and the shoulder seams, and I've left the neckline alone. So now we have our back of our pattern done, and I'm going to show you the next technique to create our front piece. The front piece is going to be created by draping using a mannequin, but you can do the draping on yourself, it's just a little more difficult. We're going to start by pinning our fabric at the 2 shoulder seams. Because we're creating a turtleneck, we want to make sure that it's pinned nice and close to the neck. Next, we're going to pin the side seam. The goal for this part is to make sure that the seam that we're pinning is straight. You can trim the fabric to make it easier as you go. Remember, when we're trimming the hem, we want to leave enough seam allowance to hem the fabric. I'm leaving 3 centimeters. The third way to do this, I'm going to show you that it is possible to pin it on yourself. Even if I use one of the other 2 techniques, I always like to try the garment on before sewing, and sometimes make adjustments to the pins. It's important when making an armhole, the smaller or higher it sits, the more mobility you're going to have for the sleeve. If you make the armhole larger, it's going to create a wing-like effect with your sleeve, which will reduce mobility of your arm. So we're going to make sure that we pin our side seam so it lands right under the arm. The next thing to keep in mind when pinning is to adjust the front and the back pieces separately. It's possible to have the shirt a little looser in the front and tight in the back. That's typically how I like my tops to fit. What I mean is that the front and the back are 2 unique pieces and you can adjust them separately. Now we're going to move it back to the mannequin and do our final pinning. So keeping in mind, we're making sure the side seams go right up to under the arm, we're pinning the shoulder seams right to the neck, and we're adjusting the front and the back pieces separately. The back piece is still a little loose, so I'm going to pin it tighter on the side seams, making sure to not pin the front piece any tighter. Once you're happy with the fit, you can sew all those seams that you just pinned with a zigzag stitch. So the shoulder seams and the 2 side seams. And then you can trim away the excess fabric on all 4 of those seams. We didn't mark out the armhole for the front piece, so we can do that now, roughly copying the existing shape of the armhole for the back piece that we already created. Because we're using a stretch fabric, it gives us a little leeway for things like this. Now we're going to measure out the length that we want for our arms, including the seam allowance at the top and how much fabric we need at the bottom to hem. This is another step that I like to use the tracing technique. I'm going to place pins mapping out the existing seam of the armhole, and then I'm going to cut along, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. I'm just going to cut half the arm, and then I'm going to fold it in half and do that mirroring technique that I did before. So folding it in half and then continuing to cut. And I made sure that I did this with enough fabric below it to account for the length measurement that we already took. So now we have our first arm, and if you like, we can give it a bit of shape. So we're going to place it on our arm, right sides together. We're going to pin along until we like the fit. I decided to make mine quite tight, but you can have any type of fit that you like. And then you're going to trim away the excess, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. And then placing this sleeve back on the fabric, we're going to trace out the second arm and cut around using the first sleeve as a stencil. And then we're going to place our sleeve right sides together and sew with a zigzag stitch. And if you like, you can trim away the extra fabric to reduce bulk. Now we're moving on to the neckline. So putting your shirt on, you're going to place pins around how you'd like the neckline to fit. You're going to do this for the front and the back of the shirt. Now we're going to move back to attaching the arms. So with the torso of our shirt inside out and our sleeves right side out, we're going to insert the sleeve into the armhole, placing right sides together. If there's any extra fabric in the shoulder of the sleeve, you want to disperse that at the top of the armhole. And then we're going to do the exact same pinning for the other sleeve, making sure that we're placing the right sides of the seams together. And then we're going to sew where we pinned with a zigzag stitch. And then if you want to reduce bulk, you can trim away the excess fabric. Now moving back to the neck, we're going to trim around where we pinned, leaving a 1 cm seam allowance. And then we're going to measure that neckline and add 2 centimeters extra. Then we're going to cut a strip of fabric in that length that's going to make up our turtleneck. I cut the width of this piece about 20 centimeters, so I had enough room to make adjustments if I'd like. Keep in mind this piece is also going to be folded in half, so it's actually going to be half the measurement that we measure out. Now we're going to fold it right sides together, and we're pinning along the width measurement that we used around 20 centimeters. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned with a zigzag stitch. Now we can try this piece on and see how it's going to fit. So we're going to place the seam at the back and fold it in half. If you like the way it fits, great, and if not, you can shorten it. I'm also going to take mine in a bit to make it slightly tighter at the top of the neck. I'm going to cut the excess, keeping in mind seam allowance of 1 centimeter. I'm also going to make a slight adjustment to make it tighter around the top of the neck. And then I'm just going to sew where I pinned. And then trim away the excess. We're now ready to attach the neck to the shirt. So with the shirt inside out and the neck right side out and folded in half, we're just going to pin along the neckline. I placed the seam at the back, and the raw edges from the neckline are tucked in between the 2 layers. And then sew where we pinned with a zigzag stitch. And then you can trim away the excess seam allowance. The final step is going to be to hem your edges. And I always like to start to do this by testing out on a scrap piece of the same fabric different types of hemming techniques. So I tried folding it over once, folding it over twice, straight stitches, zigzag stitches, and using different widths and lengths. I also tested just cutting the fabric to see if it frayed. Some fabrics will have a slight roll to them when you do this, and some will react differently. I decided to just cut my sleeves and leave the raw edge, and I also decided to make the length 3/4. So I cut one of the sleeves and then used that length to cut the other one. And then for the bottom of the shirt, I just decided to fold it over twice and pin. And make sure you iron this before you start sewing. And then I went over this seam with a straight stitch. I used a straight stitch because the hemline isn't going to need that much stretch. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.